Hi, everybody. I'm John Kiriakou, and welcome back to another Deep Focus Q&A session. I wanted to say how thrilled I am with the outpouring of support for these Q&A sessions. These are the most fun for me. I enjoy them very, very much. We've got a lot of questions. I have another 9 today that I want to get through, but I wanted to add, too, that things are going so well thanks to you. Thanks to your subscribing and watching and sharing. It's so important to me, but it's going well enough that we're gonna offer up soon a premium thing where if you want even more access, you can get more access. We can get deeper into these issues and have more personal conversations as well. So we're gonna roll that out very soon. In the meantime, we've got some great questions, and honestly, I've gone through all of them, and they're all terrific. So the first one from RAS7685. Hi, John. Do you think Edward Snowden will ever be allowed to return to the U.S. without being prosecuted? Call me crazy, but I'm going to say yes. And there's background to this. So when Ed went public with his revelations in June of 2013, I was in prison. And I wrote him a letter. I wrote him 2 letters. I wrote him a private letter that a mutual friend delivered to him in Moscow. And I wrote an open letter that went viral and had millions and millions of hits. His dad came to the prison to visit me. It was a very generous thing to do. And I said, Mr. Snowden, you've got to tell him that he has to hire the best lawyers money can buy. He has to hire my lawyers. I had the best lawyers in Washington. They specialize in national security law. And so Ed did hire my lawyers. And they were able to negotiate a deal with the Obama Justice Department. Well, almost negotiate a deal. The deal was Ed said he was willing to come home and he was willing to serve 20 years in prison if he could stand up in court and explain why he did what he did. And the Justice Department said, absolutely not. And so he stayed in Moscow. Now remember, he didn't defect to Russia. He was in the transit lounge of Moscow airport when John Kerry, the Secretary of State, revoked his passport and stranded him there. He's in Moscow today because of Barack Obama and John Kerry. Now, the reason I think that he will be able to come home is because Donald Trump has spoken very generously about him and about Julian Assange in the past. And I think once we get to a point after the coming midterm elections where there wouldn't be any political fallout for Donald Trump, I think he's going to pardon Ed Snowden. I really believe that. And in that case, Ed would be able to come home and start his new life. He married his girlfriend in Moscow. She moved to be there with him from the United States, and they now have 2 beautiful boys. It's time for him to come home and start fresh. Our next question is from QUBIT88. Can you speak more about the current Afghan government? Do you think they last the next decade or so? And also, isn't Haqqani now currently part of the Taliban? So yes, the Haqqani network has merged with the Taliban. You know, Haqqani as a person and his network as an organization, these are very bad people. They were willing to take CIA money for a little bit to do what we wanted them to do when it was clear that we were overthrowing the Taliban and we were going to kill a lot of people. But they were never friends of ours. And in fact, they kidnapped American servicemen and carried out terrorist attacks against the United States. So yes, the Haqqani network is a part of the Taliban, and they're bad people. Do I think the Taliban lasts the next decade or so? I do. And I'm almost sad to tell you why I do. It's because the Afghan people hate foreign invaders and occupiers more than they hate the Taliban. The Taliban didn't just come down from the moon and land in Afghanistan and take over. These are the sons and husbands and fathers of every Afghan family. And so they're not strangers. They're not Americans who don't speak the language and just open fire on civilians and burn down villages. As bad as things are in Afghanistan, I think Afghans prefer the Taliban to us. So I think they're gonna remain. Next one from Catherine Alvarez 09666. And thank you for your kindness, Catherine. She says, would you let or advise your children to join the CIA? Yes, no, and why? I love the podcast. I hope you get your pardon soon. Peace. Thank you very much for that. No, I would absolutely not allow my children. They're almost all adults now, but I would very strongly urge them, I would beg them not to join the CIA, not because it's dangerous. It, of course, can be dangerous. CIA officers are killed just about every single year, but because it's not an honorable organization. I realize now, as I enter the back end of my life, that it was never an honorable organization. I had rose-colored glasses on for a long time. I'm glad I finally saw what the place was like. But I wouldn't want my children to be associated with anything from murder to kidnapping to torture to secret prisons to child trafficking to drug trafficking, any of that stuff. That's not something we should be proud of as a nation or as a people. It's something that we should be ashamed of, that we should be prosecuting. So the answer is a pretty strong no. Thanks for your support. Phil 2082 says, John, I have a very important question. Why did I go to Iraq? I am an Iraq, Afghanistan veteran, and no one has ever been able to give me a real answer to this. First of all, thank you for what you did. Secondly, I think maybe I can give you an answer. It's probably not one that's going to bring you any closure or satisfaction. And I'm going to answer you by giving you a little bit of background. In early 1993, former President George H.W. Bush went to Kuwait. Okay, Bill Clinton had just become president, and and Bush had gone to Kuwait for a victory lap. So virtually as soon as he arrives, the Kuwaiti intelligence service rounds up 24 people. Some were Kuwaiti citizens, some were Iraqi citizens, and others were what are called Badoon. Badoon means without in Arabic. They're people without citizenship. They're nomads who just go across borders between Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. And they charged I think it was 26 people with attempted murder in a plot to assassinate former President Bush. So later on, after George W. Bush becomes president, I was sitting in a morning meeting at the CIA, and the secretary came in and interrupted the morning meeting, and she said, John, Secretary Powell's on the line for you. And I said, for me? I said, how does General Powell know who I am? And she said, I don't know, but he asked for you by name. So I get on the secure line. I said, good morning, Secretary Powell. How are you? And he says, cuts right to the chase. He says, John, if the Iraqis were going to kill former President Bush, who would be in charge of actually doing that? And I said, well, if you're talking about the 1993 attempt, Kuwait operations were run by Iraqi intelligence services Basra Station. But Basra Station is headed by the head of the service. That's Sabr Abdulaziz Ad-Douri. And Powell says, where does he physically sit? And I said, in Iraqi intelligence service headquarters in the Green Zone in Baghdad. And he says, thank you. And he hangs up the phone. 8 hours later, we fired 49 cruise missiles into Iraqi intelligence service headquarters. We did that at 2:00 in the morning. And so we killed a janitor. I said to my boss the next day, I killed that janitor. And he said, no, you didn't. He said, I knew you were going to say that. You didn't. You had no idea why Powell was asking the question. They were going to do whatever it is they were going to do. It wasn't on you. But then, in 2002, when I got back from Pakistan, I was promoted to be the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. And on my very first day, I walked in the office and I said, "So, what are we going to do?" And my boss said, "I can't tell you until you go to security. You have a bunch of secrecy agreements to sign." I said, okay, that's funny, but all right. I go up to the 6th floor. I go to security, knock on the door. They're expecting me. They have 6 different security agreements arrayed on a table. And so I signed each one. A security agreement, a secrecy agreement, is where you promise that you're going to take everything you learn to the grave unless it's declassified. So I signed all 6, and I said to the security director, I said, "So what's up?" And he says, "Well, next year, we're going to invade Iraq. We're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and we're going to move all of our air assets out of Saudi Arabia into Iraq, creating the largest Air Force base in the world, and thus depriving Osama bin Laden of the ability to say that we're polluting the land of the 2 holy mosques." I was shocked. And I said, all I could think to say was, "But we haven't caught bin Laden yet. Why would we invade Iraq?" And he says, "John, the decision's been made and there's nothing we can do about it." He said, "There are battle lines drawn. The pro-invasion organizations are the National Security Council, the Office of the Vice President, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The anti-invasion groups are CIA, state, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we lose." And I said, "When's this invasion supposed to happen?" And he said, "Next year, we're looking at February or March." And I went back to the deputy director's office, and he said, "You're read in?" And I said, "Are they out of their minds?" And he said, "Yeah, they are. They're out of their minds. But our job was to follow the orders." All I can tell you is it's always been my belief that you went to Iraq to exact revenge against Saddam Hussein for trying to kill George W.'s father. That was it. There was no upside otherwise to taking out Saddam Hussein. He didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. We knew that he didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. It was all about revenge. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that. It tells you a lot about the quality of leadership that we have in this country. Peter Boy, RAKS, says, "Hi, John. Thanks for the opportunity to ask you questions as you've become a hero to countless patriotic Americans." Thank you very much for that. That means a lot to me. My question is this: what should the reaction and result of the majority of Americans be if they knew that all 3 branches of federal government were no longer representative of the majority of the American people? Whew, that's a tough one. I'm not advocating violence, but I will say that Thomas Jefferson once said that the tree of liberty must occasionally be watered with the blood of patriots, of martyrs. Martyrs is what he said. We need serious governmental change in this country because you're right. None of these 3 branches of government are responsive to the majority of the American people. And what's sad to me is that the American people just seem so beaten down that they take it. Why aren't we all in the streets? Why aren't we all riding our elected officials? You know, elected officials are supposed to be responsive to us. They're not supposed to go out there, take a position, and then drag us along with them. I told a story recently about when it was the first time I worked on Capitol Hill. I was 18 years old and I got something called a Lyndon B. Johnson Congressional Internship. It was very prestigious at the time. I don't even know if it still exists, but it was a paid internship. And I went to work for my hometown congressman, Congressman Joe Coulter, conservative Democrat from Pennsylvania. It was a learning experience that I could not possibly have gotten otherwise. And I had a master's degree in legislative affairs. You don't get the inside scoop until you're actually working on Capitol Hill. And just as one example, the biggest issue of the day, and this is going to sound kind of silly, but this was big in the beginning of the Reagan administration. It was the budget for the Environmental Protection Agency. right? Because there were these super fun sites, Love Canal. There was a super fun dump site in Missouri, and we needed billions of dollars to clean this stuff up. We got hundreds of letters in the congressman's office saying, vote yes on EPA funding, vote yes on EPA funding. It was unanimous. I was there in the office the day of the vote for EPA funding, and the bells went off, indicating that the vote was starting. So I went into the congressman's office. He had had knee surgery recently, so I had to push him in a wheelchair to the floor of the House. And I said, Congressman, the EPA vote started. We should start over to the floor. Well, when I went into the office, I see that he's actually playing poker with Dan Rostenkowski, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and Bob Rhoda, who was the postmaster of the House. Two important names. So he said, I'm playing cards. Give me a little bit of time. And I said, okay. I went into the chief of staff's office and I went, and he said, I understand, but don't worry about it. Well, there's another bell at 5 minutes and another bell at 10 minutes. And I went back into the office and I said, Congressman, we only have 5 minutes to get to the floor. And he said, yeah, I know. Don't rush me. Don't rush me. Get out of here. Leave me alone. 5 minutes passed. There's a buzzer. Bzz, the vote's over. He missed the vote. I went back in. I said, Congressman, what do I tell these people? We had hundreds of letters saying that they wanted you to vote yes on EPA funding. And he says, it's been in the papers that I had knee surgery. Tell them I tried to walk over to the floor of the House and I fell down and hurt myself. But if I had been healthy, I would have voted yes. And so we put out a press release, a completely phony press release, saying that he had fallen down on his rush to the floor of the House to vote yes on EPA funding. Okay, fast forward about 14 months. I'm working in the campaign office in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, and my dad calls me in the middle of the workday. And he says, in a whisper, are you in some kind of trouble? I said, no, why? And he said, because the FBI's here and they want to talk to you. I said, oh my God. I was panicked. I locked up the campaign office, jumped in my car, drove the 20 miles back to my hometown, got to the house, and sure enough, there's an FBI agent there. And he introduces himself. He shows me his badge. And he says, have you ever seen the congressman snort cocaine? I said, what? No. He said, have you ever seen the staff snort cocaine? And I said, no. And I was so scared. Remember, I'm 18 years old. Or by then I was 19. I was so scared. I said, they all smoke weed on Friday afternoons. And he says, no, I'm not interested in that. He says, have you ever seen the congressman trade cocaine for stamps? And I said, no. Well, other people had. And as it turned out, that's why he was so close to Dan Rostenkowski, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, or Ways and Means Committee is what it was, that they wrote the tax laws. And Bob Rhoda, he was buying stamps on his congressional account from Bob Rhoda, as was Dan Rostenkowski. And Rostenkowski was cashing in the stamps for cash and sort of distributing the cash as bribes to people that he wanted to do things for him. The congressman was using the cash to buy Coke and was, I don't know, using it, selling it. I don't know. I've never been clear. They all three went to prison. But that's a day in the life on Capitol Hill. It's nothing that the American people think. I ended up working on the Senate side under John Kerry later on. I just finally came to the conclusion that they're all corrupt and they're all liars and none of them give a shit what the American people want or think. And that has to change. Okay. Sean Sanders, 1281, says, I have a question. With Russia suffering nearly 1 million casualties in the war in Ukraine, do you think the CIA is currently looking to take out Putin? It seems to be an advantageous moment. That's a great question. And it really is impossible to answer. If this were the 1970s, I'd say absolutely, positively, 100% yes, they're looking to take out Putin, because that's what they did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They just killed any foreign leader that didn't toe the line. That changed in 75. And now that the world has become so much more sophisticated. It's far, far more difficult to do something like that. I would say they probably are not looking to kill him, to take him out. They probably are looking to make his life as difficult as possible, to wreck the Russian economy, to devastate the Russian military, to disrupt Russia's foreign relations, and just to make it so uncomfortable in Russia that eventually the Russian people rise up and take him out. I think that's probably the more likely scenario. Very hard to accomplish, though. New York Babs says, John, why is it that the neighboring nations don't support Gaza? Is it fear of the Israeli state? Great question. Kind of a sad answer. Let's use Jordan and Egypt as the most obvious examples. I don't know if you've ever been to Jordan or Egypt, but they're both desperately poor countries. And they have very high growth rates. They can't feed everybody that needs to be fed. They can't clothe them, and they certainly can't provide jobs for them. If there were to be an influx of Palestinians, as many as 2 million Palestinians, that would serve to do two things. Number one, it would absolutely devastate the Egyptian or Jordanian, frankly, economies, devastate them to the point where it would be generations before they could come back. People would starve to death. There would be widespread famine. There would probably be an uprising, whether it's, Egyptians or Jordanians against their governments, or Egyptians and Jordanians against the Palestinians for coming in and taking their food and their jobs. One or the other. Number two, it would only serve to help the Israelis in their policy of ethnic cleansing. The Israelis want all the Palestinians to leave. And so, as a matter of principle, the Egyptians and Jordanians won't take them. Now, it's a little worse even for Jordan, because when the Nakba took place back in 1948, almost all the Palestinians, not all, but almost all the Palestinians ran to Jordan. The idea was that they would be there for 6 months or 12 months, and the Arabs would get together and fight the Israelis and take Palestine back, and everybody would live happily ever after. And that didn't happen. And so here we are now, where there have been 4, 5 generations of Palestinians born in Jordan who are not Jordanian citizens. They're Palestinian. They've never been given Jordanian citizenship. And you know how you can tell? Because Jordanians have a green passport and Palestinians who live in Jordan have a black passport. And again, once the Israelis finish with Gaza, the conventional wisdom is that they're going to turn their attention to the West Bank, try to push all those Palestinians out, either to Jordan or to Syria, and take the West Bank in the name of Greater Israel. The Jordanians, the Egyptians, don't want to help them commit genocide. That's what it comes down to. You know what? Let me add one thing to that question. I spent about 5 years living in the Persian Gulf, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. The entire middle class of those countries was Palestinian. The Palestinians are lawyers, they're university professors and teachers, they're engineers, they're bankers. It's the Palestinians that make the economies run, right? You've got the Bangladeshis and Filipinos and Indians that are, sweeping the streets. And then, of course, the Arabs themselves, get free money for doing nothing. But it's the Palestinians that make those countries run. And because of that, there's resentment against them. But the resentment became especially bad after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, when Yasser Arafat decided to throw his lot in with Saddam Hussein. The Gulf Arabs turned on the Palestinians, and even 35 years later, things haven't returned to the way they used to be. McKinnon Vids says, hi, John. I was curious what other kinds of interests you have or something you have always thought you might like to pursue. Love from Canada. Thank you for asking that. I am a gigantic baseball and football fan, specifically the lowly Pittsburgh Pirates. I don't care. I still love the Pirates. And the mighty Pittsburgh Steelers. Never miss a game. My personal passion is art. I bought my first signed, numbered Picasso etching when I was 21 years old. It bankrupted me, but I still have it, and I love it, and it's worth 20 times what I paid. I've got 4 Andy Warhols. I have a Jasper Johns. I have a Fernando Botero. And I've bought and sold a couple of pieces. I bought and sold a Picasso. I bought and sold a Miro. I bought and sold a Liechtenstein. And I have a Liechtenstein actually still. It's the only vice I have. I don't smoke. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. I don't party. I don't have fancy cars. But oh my God, do I love art. And I'm willing to spend ridiculous amounts of money when I had money on it. I've begun giving it to my kids. And they love it as much as I do. I can't believe that my kids are as fanatical about Andy Warhol as I am, but they are. I even have 2 things that Andy Warhol used to own. I own his desk lamp, which I bought at auction, and I own a ceramic candlestick that I bought at Sotheby's in an auction. That, and I probably should have gone to film school, and I would have had a happier life. But no sense in crying over spilt milk. Finally, Money Heist says, John, when are you releasing your book about the cemeteries? I was really intrigued to hear about it on the Danny Jones podcast. Thank you. I want to strangle my publisher. I texted him day before yesterday and I said, dude, what's up? And he said, I promise I'll get right back to you soon. I sent them. Here's the story. I wrote 7 books about the CIA, and I'm tired of writing about the CIA. So I decided to write a book about something that I love, and there are very few things in the world that I love more than cemeteries. I go to cemeteries everywhere I go around the world, whether in the United States or overseas. I've been to hundreds and hundreds of cemeteries. I find them incredibly peaceful. I find them beautiful. I love the architecture. I love the symbolism on the stones, and I love that everybody has a story. When I was 9 years old, this is how it all got started. We lived about a mile from a cemetery. And I told my mom one day I was going to ride my bike to the cemetery with an empty shoebox because I was going to look for salamanders under rocks. So I bicycle over to the cemetery and I find a salamander. I put it in the box. I take it home. My mom said, did you find any salamanders? And I said, yeah, I found one. And it was next to a stone that had a funny circle on it. And she said, what kind of a circle? And I said, it said Congressional Medal of Honor. And she said, oh, that's a hero. We should go to the library and see what he did. So we went to the library. We were regulars at the public library when I was growing up. And we found a reference to this man. He lived in my hometown and was recruited into the 22nd Pennsylvania Volunteers during the Civil War, and he captured the Confederate battle flag at the Battle of Petersburg, Virginia. He returned to Newcastle and farmed until passing away in 1876. So he's buried in the local cemetery and has a Congressional Medal of Honor disc on his stone. My mom told me, she said, that's the thing about cemeteries. The rich people all have these big stones, but they're not the important ones or the interesting ones. She said, everybody has a story, and it doesn't matter how big their gravestone is. And it just took a hold of me. So I decided for my 8th book, I was going to write a book called Remains of the Day, The Definitive Guide to Washington, D.C.'s Historic Cemeteries. And I listen, it normally takes me 9 months to write a book. I banged this thing out in 6 weeks. I sent it to my publisher, Simon & Schuster. And I said, look, I know you guys don't normally do books like this, but humor me and just give it a read. And I told him what it was about. And he said, yeah, we don't really do books like that, but okay, we'll read it. 2 weeks later, he calls me. This is the editor. And he says, this is the best book you've ever written. we'll take it. And I said, hey, great. Simon & Schuster has a PR budget, right? That was 3.5 years ago. And they're still sitting on it. But anyway, he called me back and he said, listen, the editorial board loved this book so much, we want to commission 4 more. They commissioned Whispers in the Dirt, The Mafia Graves of New York City, which I'm almost done with. They commissioned The Historic Cemeteries of Chicago, The Country Western Graves of Nashville, and The Graves of America's Most Notorious Serial Killers. So I called them again a couple of weeks ago and I said, look, I'm tired of playing games with you guys. If you're not going to publish it, just let me know and I'll go. My first book was published by Random House. I'll just go to Random House, or I'll go to a little imprint that just publishes cemetery books. This is kind of a subgenre. And he said, no. He said, I've got the contract. We want all 5 of the books. I'm going to send it to you. Okay. He promised to send it to me by the 31st. We're recording this on the 29th. This thing should come out soon, but your guess is as good as mine. In the meantime, I'm just about done with the Mafia book. I think I'm going to finish it in the next 4 weeks. And I've actually already bought a ticket to Chicago. I'm going to go to Chicago in 3 weeks and do more of the research there. That's going to be kind of a fat book. There are a lot of cemeteries in Chicago. But thanks for asking. I'm excited about it. I'll let you know as soon as it's available on Amazon for pre-order. Hoping for the best. We'll see. In the meantime, I want to thank you again for your support. Thank you for subscribing and sharing and liking and talking about the podcast. It means a lot to me. We'll keep you updated on a premium content thing that we're thinking about right now. And I just want to say thanks again. So take it easy from John. Bye-bye.